All right. And with that, we might as well just get started. Couple things before we begin, some introductions and housekeeping. I'm Riley Mans from the Delta Institute. We're partnering on this project with Allegan Conservation District and the Michigan Farm Bureau. I'm joined today by with Brian Talsma from the district and Laura Campbell from Michigan Farm Bureau. If the two of you just want to introduce yourselves briefly, I'll go over housekeeping after that.
Sure. I'm Brian Talsma. I'm the watershed technician at Allegan Conservation District. So I handle all of our grants related to our watershed management plan goals. And that includes reducing nutrients and sediment erosion in the watershed and runoff into our rivers. So that'll be what we're focusing on this project.
All right, thanks and welcome everybody who's able to join us this afternoon. I'm Laura Campbell. I manage the Agricultural Ecology Department for Michigan Farm Bureau. So Michigan Farm Bureau is your voice of agriculture, representing more than 40,000 farmers across the state. And one of the projects that we work on is helping local conservation districts and project partners with grant projects and conservation programs that help farmers to achieve their stewardship goals. So we're really happy to be here.
Awesome. Thanks, Laura. Thanks, Brian. Just a couple housekeeping points here. This webinar is being recorded, so just keep that in mind. The recording will also be available on Delta Institute's website at the link shown on the slide there. Your mics and cameras have both been disabled. They'll remain disabled for the entirety of the webinar, except for the question and answer session at the end if folks feel like getting into more of a discussion. I think it's a small enough group where having the mics turned on won't be super problematic. That said, if you have questions that come up on specific slides during the presentation, I ask that you either use the Q&A function that you'll find at the bottom toolbar of the Zoom interface, or just simply type your question in directly into the chat box. And we'll put those in a queue, or I'll direct it to Brian or Laura respectively, and we can answer those as they come up if they seem relevant to the slide. But other than that, all of your questions that end up in the Q&A queue or the chat box will be answered at the end of the webinar. So with that, Brian, it's your show.
All right. Thanks, Riley, and good afternoon, everyone. So our project that we're going to be talking about today is our Phosphorus Reduction Auction, focused in a portion of the Kalamazoo River watershed around Lake Allegan, just upstream of Lake Allegan, where phosphorus runoff is a big concern for us. So I'm with the Allegan Conservation District. We will be doing all the on-the-ground work, working with participants, collecting bids, doing everything kind of up front. And then we're also partnered with the Delta Institute, who's handling a lot of the project management aspects of the project. They will be the ones who make the contracts with the participants. They'll be paying participants, and they do a lot of the management aspects. And then we also have Michigan Farm Bureau with us, who's been generous enough to help us with outreach and getting word out about this project so that we can get as many participants as possible. So just briefly, I'll give you an overview of this project. Our goal is to demonstrate that we can do a market-based solution for reducing nutrient runoff. And that means that we want to demonstrate that if we give producers, farmers, the ability to kind of set their own price and bid on the reductions that they're creating through conservation practices, that maybe we could create a market where businesses could fund those practices instead of just through federal grant projects. So this project is going to be ending in January 2023. That gives us about 2 years to implement these conservation practices and to do everything that needs to be done. It's funded through the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. That's a grant that Delta Institute holds and they are working with the other partners to get the project done. So I'll start with our project area. We are kind of in the southeastern corner of the county here. You can see the county lines there on the map, kind of between Allegan and Martin and Otsego. So in any field that's at least partially in this project area can be submitted as with a bid to participate. And if you would like to look on your own, if you go to our project website, so following that link will bring you to this website on Delta Institute's website. You can scroll down and see a project map that you can actually zoom in and find your specific crossroads. If you want to view a larger map, you can click that full screen button and then also see a satellite view. So if you wanted to look at some fields up close, you'd be able to find your fields and see if any part of them is within that blue project area, then you're eligible to apply for funding for that field. So as I said, if any part of the field is in the project area, you can submit an application for it. And we're going to be looking at each field independently. So even if your home farm isn't in the project area or your business address isn't in the project area, you can still submit any field that does fall within those boundaries. So once you've figured out which fields you can apply for, you're going to be you want to look at what conservation practices you can get funding for. We have 3 eligible practices. That's cover crop, reduced till, and no-till. And then there are a few things over here to keep in mind as you're considering which practices you would like to apply for. Each of your fields can have different practices. I know that sometimes cover crops isn't always an option on your field. So if you wanted to have some of your fields enrolled with cover crops and some of them without, that's perfectly fine. The practices need to be new on the field, and I put that on quotation marks because it doesn't need to be entirely new. It just means that the practice can't have been implemented within the previous year. So if you didn't do cover crops in 2020 on a field, then you could get funding for cover crops in 2021 through this program. For this auction this year, all the contracts will be 2 years. So you'll have to implement whatever practices you sign up for over the course of those 2 years. And perennial crops like hay, alfalfa are not eligible for funding. So quickly, what we're looking for when we say cover crops is that you're planting as soon as possible after you harvest your cash crop. And you're informing us ahead of time of the species and seeding rate so that we kind of have an idea of what to look for. We're going to be out taking pictures of these practices to document that you've done them so that you can get paid. Cover crops cannot be sold or harvested for seed, even if that's for your own use. This is in accordance with NRCS guidelines, but you can graze or mow the cover crops for feed. There are a few restrictions there that we can discuss on an individual basis if that's something that you're interested in. For the tillage practices, if you are looking at reduced till, what we mean by that is something that leaves about 30% crop residue. Crop residue isn't the only way that we can calculate that, and we can work through individually what a reduced till system might look like with your equipment. But in general, you're going to be using a chisel plow, disc, field cultivator, or vertical tillage, all kind of qualify as something that is reduced till. In some cases, the tillage operations might be too intensive to qualify for reduced till. So that'll be something that when you apply, we can discuss what that looks like for your field in particular. But the biggest thing here is that you're not using primary inversion implements So like a mold board plow, where you're completely kind of flipping all the dirt over and getting a clean slate. We want to see residue on that field to prevent erosion as much as possible. No-till is pretty self-explanatory. No tillage operations on the field during the contract years. We do allow some limited tillage for fixing ruts if that's necessary, but in general, no tillage on the field. So once you have figured out which fields are in the project area and which fields are, which practices you want to implement on each of those fields, you'll need to decide on your bid price. So we are looking for bids in dollars per acre. And then when we digitize those fields, when we put them into our computer system, we'll figure out the exact acreage, and that'll give us the total price for the field. We will figure out the phosphorus reduction, which is how we are funding these practices. And then we'll go on to rank the bids. So when you're setting a bid price, we are hoping for you to consider your cost and bid close to those costs. The most cost-effective bids will be the ones that we award. So the lower your bid price, the more likely you are to receive funding. Also, to keep in mind, if you're having a difficult time kind of figuring out what you want to bid, I recommend that you look at the NRCS cost share options or other cost share options that might be available to you depending on your area. So for example, I think the NRCS rate for no-till is something like $16 and change. So you wouldn't want to bid below that price if you can get a contract with NRCS to do the same thing. So once we have all the bids kind of gathered, we're going to be estimating the reduction in phosphorus runoff for each field. And this is how we prioritize the bid. So we'll be looking at the cost per pound of phosphorus reduction. And then the most cost-effective bids will be all funded at the same rate. So there's an example here where we've got 3 bids. In this example, farm A was a small phosphorus reduction. So this might be a flat field or a field that doesn't experience a lot of erosion. So there's not a lot of phosphorus runoff to begin with. With their bid, we find that their cost effectiveness was about $50 per pound. And in this case, that might be above the threshold that we can award. There were other bids that were lower. Farm B, when we do the calculation, it ends up to be about $10 per pound. And Farm C ends up to be about $15 per pound. If we were to set our threshold for this auction at $15 per pound, then all of the contracts would be awarded the same rate. So even though Farm B bid $5,000, they would be awarded a $7,500 contract because we would bump them up to that $15 per pound rate. So the takeaway here is that your bid price will not necessarily be the rate at which you're paid. You could be paid higher than your bid price, but you will never be paid lower than your bid price. And I know that's a little bit confusing, so I think if there's any questions here, I'll pause for that. All right, so I don't think any popped in. I'm not seeing any.
Nope, doesn't look like it.
All right. So once we've selected the most cost-effective bids, those farmers will be offered a contract for 2 years, as I said at the beginning here. So for each of those years, I'll be coming out and verifying that the practices are completed. So I'll be just taking pictures of the field, and that'll be after planting for your tillage practices. And then after you've harvested for the cover crop practices, and of course, after you've harvested the cover crop, or sorry, planted the cover crop. So that is how the program works. I know I went pretty quickly, so are there any questions about it? And I think you can go ahead and unmute yourself if you have a question, or feel free to type that into the Q&A or chat boxes for Zoom. If you have any questions or would like to receive a bid packet, you can see my contact information right there on the slide. That's the office phone number. So we're teleworking most days, but I will return your phone call as soon as I can. The quickest way to get a hold of me will be through email.
All right, well, it sounds like we can wrap this up. Thanks again, Laura and Brian, for hosting, and everybody that was in attendance. Again, Brian's contact information is up on the slide now. Get in touch if you have questions. But other than that, enjoy the rest of your day. And thanks again.
Thanks, everybody.